She needed the money bad enough to lie about who she was, and even winning the women's division outright wouldn't have covered what her father's heart needed. When she tried to sign up for the open division, the men at the table laughed her out of the room. "You won't last 3 seconds," the champion told her, and made sure she couldn't even try. That night, Josephine Tillman locked the bathroom door, cut off 11 inches of hair with a pair of sewing shears, and made the kind of decision a person only makes once in a life. She entered as a man. Days later, in front of a packed grandstand in the Bighorn Basin, dust hanging thick under the arena lights and the announcer's voice cracking over the loudspeaker. She was riding one of the rankest bulls anyone in that arena had ever seen come out of a chute, when something in her hand gave way with a sound like a dry branch snapping. A finger had broken clean, tears came to the corner of her eye, but she didn't let go of the rope. When she finally kicked free and hit the dirt rolling, something happened in front of the whole grandstand that stopped the rodeo cold, every hand along that rail forgetting for a moment to breathe. Stay through to the end to find out what it was, and drop a comment telling us where in the country you're watching this from. Josephine Tillman was holding a mare's hind leg, checking a stone bruise, when she heard her father's cough carry across the corral. Not the first time that week. She set the hoof down easy and walked over. "It's nothing," Silas Tillman said, one fist pressed flat against his chest. "Just the dust." It wasn't the dust. That cough had been showing up without cause for the better part of a month. Worse, whenever he carried something heavy or stood too long on his feet. Josephine had learned to read animals before she'd learned much else in life. The way an ear turns a half-second before a kick, the way an eye changes color, a beat before a spook, and she read her father the same way. It was Josephine who finally talked him into driving to the clinic in Cody. He came back with a diagnosis that needed surgery, and not the kind any hospital in 3 counties could do. The nearest place that did that procedure right, a heart center called Bridger Regional, sat 3 hours south down 2-lane blacktop, and the number they quoted came to $120,000. Josephine didn't have that kind of money. Nobody in the family did, not with a spread that barely broke even most years, and a father who'd never once carried debt he could avoid. Worse still was the insurance. The Tillmans had carried the same policy through a small outfit called Frontier Mutual for more than 20 years, the kind of policy people in that part of Wyoming called grandfathered and trusted the way they trusted an old truck that still started every morning. When Josephine called Bridger Regional to schedule, she was told flat out that Frontier Mutual wasn't accepted there anymore, hadn't been for the better part of a year. Without an updated letter proving the old policy still carried weight, even cash in hand wouldn't get the surgery on the books, and that letter meant a trip to the state insurance office in Cheyenne, and a line nobody could say how long would take to clear. Her father didn't have the health or the patience to chase that kind of paperwork, and Josephine kept the whole mess from him. He was tired enough carrying the sickness without carrying the worry of it too. She decided to fix it the only way she knew how, on the back of a horse. Silas Tillman had been a standout hand around the Bighorn Basin decades back, though his name never went up on any banner. He'd ridden in a time before anybody filmed a thing, when a man's reputation lasted only as long as the dust took to settle. But the old-timers who saw him ride never forgot it. He taught his daughter the same way, far from any spotlight, in a dirt corral behind the house, and he didn't teach her strength. He taught her patience. "A man who rides angry falls before the 4th second," he used to say. "A man who waits for the animal's own moment can hold on as long as he needs to. A bull isn't your enemy. He's scared in his own way. Your job isn't to beat that fear out of him. It's to understand him before he decides what he's going to do." He said that so many times over the years that Josephine could hear it in his voice, even when he wasn't in the room. The same flat, unhurried cadence. No more urgency in it than a man commenting on the weather. That same morning, Before the entry office, Josephine stopped by the back corral, where a newly bought colt had refused a saddle for the better part of a week. The hired trainer had given up on him twice already, calling him sour and not worth the feed. Emiliano Vega, who'd come up from Chihuahua 30 years back and worked the Tillman place as a hand who knew horses the old vaquero way, had told her once that half of what people called a mean-tempered animal was really an animal answering something a man hadn't bothered to notice. Josephine watched from outside the fence a long while, saying nothing, and saw the colt throw his head toward the iron gate every time it groaned on its hinge. Not a hopeless colt. Just a sound he couldn't stand. She found a rag and a can of axle grease in the tack shed, worked the hinge until the groan disappeared, and inside the hour the colt stood for the saddle without a single buck. She never told anyone how she'd solved it. She just did, the way her father had taught her to solve most things, quietly and without needing credit for it after. Josephine had grown up competing in the small rodeos nobody from the big circuit watched, where the purse barely covered the gas there and back. The marquee event of the season, the only one with a purse big enough to cover a surgery of that size, paid double for the open division. The women's division paid next to nothing. Entries closed in 4 days. She counted her savings from selling eggs and preserves at the Saturday market, counted what was left after the vet bill, counted again hoping the number would change. It didn't. She went to the entry office first thing, determined to try it the right way first. The office ran out of a plain plywood building beside the holding pens, a folding table set up with a coffee urn, and a stack of forms held down against the wind with a horseshoe. The man checking entries that morning was Wade Cordell, the most respected hand on the circuit that season, holder of the arena record, 94 points aboard a bull called Widowmaker that had put grown men in the dirt without a second thought. Cordell didn't ask her name. He looked at the form, looked at her, and laughed without taking the toothpick out of his mouth. "This one won't last 3 seconds," he said, not bothering to lower his voice for the line of riders behind her. "A woman's place around here is cooking or sweeping the stands." Vince Ashford, the rodeo's judge, stood at his elbow going through another stack of entries and nodded before she'd opened her mouth. "Ladies' division closes next week, miss. Come back for the weekend that's meant for you." "I don't want the ladies' division," Josephine said, holding her voice steady. "I want the open. I learned from somebody who knew what he was doing." Ashford shook his head and handed the form back, without really looking at it, already turning to the young man stepping up behind her. "Rule's the rule. Big purse, big bulls, not the place to learn." "I didn't come to learn," Josephine said. "I came to compete." The young man farther back in line laughed low, mimicking Cordell's tone, and somebody else near the coffee urn joined in. She didn't turn to see who it was. She'd learned young that giving that kind of laughter any attention only fed it. She folded the form, thanked them quietly, because that was how it was done, without giving anybody reason to remember her face later, and left. Neither man knew whose daughter she was. The name Silas Tillman, written right there on the form, meant nothing to Cordell or Ashford, because Silas had ridden a generation before theirs, in an era with no record of anything, and had never once brought it up with the newer hands. The legend who'd taught Josephine to ride was, without either man realizing it, the same man who needed that surgery urgently. Josephine drove back, with the form still folded in her jacket, and didn't tell her father what had happened. She went to the corral, sat on the bench where he used to teach her, and stayed there working out how to turn the whole thing around before the deadline passed, and his heart gave out waiting on paperwork. She'd been carrying a small pair of shears in her bag for days already, not sure why, the way a person carries a spare length of rope just in case. That night, sitting on the porch after her father fell asleep early, plate half full, she counted the days left. 4. Counted the amount still owed, nearly all of it. Counted how many times in her life she'd already heard that a woman's place was somewhere else. The money, one way or another, she could chase down, sell more eggs, ask a buyer for an advance, risk a loan against the truck. The insurance letter had no shortcut. It needed time her father didn't have, a line nobody could promise would move fast even with a senator's office leaning on it. If she could take the open division purse in time, at least one of the two weights would stop pressing down. She sat a long while in the dark of the porch, turning that math over, the way she'd turn over a stone looking for what was under it. And by the time the porch light drew its ring of moths, she'd already decided, even if some part of her hadn't caught up to the decision yet. She went into the bathroom, locked the door quiet so as not to wake anybody, and pulled the shears out of the bag she'd been carrying them in for days without quite admitting why. Looked in the small mirror she'd fixed her hair in front of since she was a girl before every rodeo. Thought about her father asleep on the other side of the wall, about Cordell laughing at the table, about the way Ashford hadn't even really looked at her form before handing it back. She lifted the first length of hair with her free hand, breathed once, and closed the shears. It fell into the sink in pieces until what was left was shorter than anything she'd worn in her life. She didn't cry while she cut it. She cried after, sitting on the cold floor, looking at the hair she'd need to clean up before her father woke. She swept it into a bag before sunrise and buried it past the old pasture fence. Made coffee, served it the way she did every morning. Silas looked at her over the rim of his cup and raised an eyebrow. "Cut your hair." "It was getting in the way of work," Josephine said, not quite meeting his eyes. "Grows back." He didn't ask anything more. He had his own trouble taking up most of his attention, and Josephine knew that was exactly why she could hide things from him so easily. She didn't like taking advantage of a sick man's distraction. She just didn't see another way through it. She pulled loose jeans and an oversized shirt from the closet, an old hat that shaded most of her face, nothing she didn't already wear for heavy work. The only real difference was the short hair and the closed-off posture she practiced in the mirror. Shoulders forward, heavier step, chin down. She filled out a new form in tight, cramped handwriting, wrote only J. Tillman in the name field, initials that could read either way, and signed underneath with a scrawl that didn't say much of anything. Nothing on the form asked for a photograph. Nobody had ever imagined they'd need to check who was really standing behind it. She drove back the next day, earlier, when only a seasonal clerk minded the desk, too busy with last-minute entries to pay attention to detail. "Name," he said without looking up. "Joe Tillman," she answered, dropping her voice low. He stamped the form and handed it back, without ever really seeing her face under the brim. First go-round Saturday, chute 3. That was it. On the drive home, she passed the old corral and stopped the truck a minute, needing to breathe. She remembered her father once mentioning a young man who used to show up outside that same fence, never came in, just watched him train, and one day stopped coming. "Curious kid," Silas had said. "Learned just from watching. Never asked me for a thing." Josephine hadn't connected anything at the time. She filed the memory away, without knowing it would matter again. The first go-round happened on a hot Saturday, the pen crowded with green riders trying their luck. Josephine stayed at the back, studying the animals as they were run through, and noticed the bull she'd drawn, called Lightning Jack, always snorted before his hardest buck, a tell almost nobody bothered to notice. She rode without drawing attention, read the snort, shifted her weight a beat before the animal decided, and stepped off clean when the horn sounded. Nobody clapped much. That was exactly what she wanted. The days between go-rounds turned into an exhausting double life. Mornings she worked the ranch alongside her father, pretending everything was fine, hiding the fatigue behind a quick smile and short answers about chores that needed doing. Afternoons she trained in secret, out past the far pasture where no truck ever passed on the county road, working on her walk, her low voice, the closed posture, the way she carried herself without seeming forced. Nights she still found time to call Bridger Regional about the letter, always hearing the same answer, that without the new paperwork from Cheyenne, there was no date to give her, no matter what she had in the bank. A childhood friend, Rosalie Doss, was the only person who knew everything: the disguise, the prize money, the letter stuck in a line that wasn't moving. Rosalie worked the same market stall where Josephine sold eggs and preserves, and it was Rosalie who'd helped cut her hair properly straight in the back of her own house, away from anybody's eyes, trimming what Josephine had hacked at in the dark. What if they figure it out mid-rodeo? Josephine asked her on one of the hardest nights, sitting on Rosalie's back steps with a flashlight between them. Then you'll have tried, Rosalie said. Better than watching your dad wait in a line that doesn't move. On days without a go-round, Josephine trained alone behind the house on an old, docile bull kept on the ranch for exactly that purpose, gentle enough not to hurt her, but still useful for working posture and reflex. She repeated the same motion hundreds of times. Feel the animal's weight shift. Adjust the body a beat before, never after. It was the kind of practice that never made it into any footage, the kind nobody filmed, just hours of quiet repetition in the heat, dust settling in her collar, the same way her own father had trained decades back with nobody watching but the fence posts. By the second go-round, the pen was fuller. A couple of older hands murmured that the new kid, this Joe Tillman, had a strange way of sitting a bull, too calm for somebody new. "Where'd you learn to ride like that?" one asked, leaning on the rail. "From an old man I knew," she answered, choosing her words with care. "Doesn't compete anymore, just teaches." It was during that round that she saw Wade Cordell up close for the first time since the refusal. He watched her a beat longer than the others, didn't say a word, just noticed the way she waited for the bull to decide its move before she reacted. "That one rides like somebody from an older time," he said to Ashford. "Doesn't look like fresh training." Between the second and third round, a scare nearly ended everything. A neighbor passing through town caught sight of Josephine from a distance, still dressed as Joe, and narrowed his eyes at something familiar in her walk, but didn't get close enough to be sure. Josephine only learned of it days later, overhearing the same neighbor tell her father, right in front of her, that he'd seen a boy near the ranch who walked funny, looked a lot like somebody. She waited for the comment to pass, and from that day on, avoided training anywhere near the main road. The math kept tightening. If she reached the finals and placed near the top, the purse would cover the surgery outright and leave enough to pay somebody to push the letter through faster than she could manage herself. But reaching the finals meant crossing paths with Cordell in the arena, the same man who'd told her she wouldn't last 3 seconds. That same week, her father's condition worsened. He started feeling short of breath sitting still, doing nothing that should have cost him effort. A nurse the family had known for years examined him and said gently that his heart wasn't going to hold out through months of waiting on a line. "You've been acting strange lately," Silas said on the drive home. "Just work, Dad. It's fine." He didn't push, too tired even to press, and Josephine felt the weight of that lie settle heavier than any bull she'd ever ridden. The third go-round drew a tougher bull, one with a history of actually hurting riders. Watching from a distance beforehand, she noticed this one reacted differently whenever somebody clapped too close to the rail. Partway through the ride, a spectator clapped without thinking. The bull reacted exactly as expected, and Josephine adjusted her body a beat before the crowd noticed anything had changed. She covered the full count with a scare almost nobody else caught, stepped off with her breath ragged, and a stockhand logged a modest number without much attention. Just another name on a long list, exactly the cover she needed. That night, going back over the day the way her father had taught her, separating what worked from what nearly went wrong, she learned she'd advanced straight to the semi-final, and that the semi-final would happen the same weekend Wade Cordell defended his record. Her name, Joe Tillman, appeared on a list right beside his for the first time. Some rumbling had already started outside the arena gate that week, too. A small knot of animal welfare folks with hand-painted signs objecting to the flank strap used to encourage a bull's kick. an old argument in that part of the country that never seemed to settle one way or the other. Stock contractors swearing it caused no more discomfort than a loose belt. Critics swearing otherwise, though it never amounted to more than a few raised voices near the gate. Josephine drove home with the folded list in her pocket, found her father already asleep in his chair, radio playing low, a dose of medicine forgotten on the side table. She turned off the radio, covered him with a blanket, and stood there watching his chest rise and fall, slower than she liked. She thought about telling him everything, started to, and stopped. Telling him meant risking that he'd try to stop her, or worse, spend what little strength he had left worrying about her instead of holding on. She didn't tell him. She thought about Cordell's line at the entry table and felt, for the first time since cutting her hair, a different kind of hunger to win. Not just the surgery money anymore. That line, waiting to be answered. Not with words, but with however long she could stay on the back of a bull in front of everybody who'd laughed. The morning of the semi-final started wrong before sunrise. Josephine woke to a short, breathless moan from her father's room, a sound she'd never heard him make. She ran in and found him sitting up in bed, one hand pressed flat to his chest, his lips gone a color that wasn't right. Dad, what's wrong? Tight, he managed, voice thin, barely any air behind it. Hurts. She didn't think twice. She called the neighbor with the bigger truck, helped her father down to the road, and rode with him to the clinic in town, her own heart pounding as hard as his seemed to be beating weak. On the way, she held his hand the whole ride, repeating low that it was going to be fine, without knowing if that was true, the truck's tires sliding a little on the gravel curves. She thought without meaning to of the first time he'd taught her to ride. Decades of knowledge folded into one line he repeated always, "Watch before you act," and how there was nothing left to watch inside that truck. Only to wait until they arrived. A young doctor examined Silas fast, hooked him to a monitor, and said after a few minutes that felt like an hour that it wasn't a heart attack. It was a heart worn thin, giving out a warning it couldn't wait much longer to make good on. He needed full rest, and that surgery as soon as it could be arranged. Josephine felt the relief of it, not being the worst outcome mix, with the weight of knowing the deadline had just gotten shorter. Past 10 that morning, stable now on a clinic cot, with a line in his arm, Silas noticed his daughter glancing anxious at the clock on the wall. "You got something today," he said. "Not really a question. It's nothing important, Dad. I've known you since the day you were born. I know when something's sitting heavy on you." "Whatever it is," he said, voice weak. "Go. I'll be fine here. Got a nurse? Got a doctor? You're not going to fix anything sitting in a clinic chair watching me sleep. And if something happens, they'll call and you'll come running the way you came today. But don't sit here. Go." Josephine kissed his forehead, promised to be back the second it was over, and left running. Entries for the semi-final closed at noon, an hour's drive away. She arrived with the clock against her, hadn't eaten since the night before, hadn't slept right in days, changed into Joe's clothes fast in the office bathroom, and went straight to the holding pen without a minute to watch the bull she'd drawn. The one ritual that had always worked went undone. The semi-final bull, nicknamed Twister, was known for fast, unpredictable bucks with no clear pattern most of the others had. Josephine mounted still, trying to catch her breath, her head somewhere else, her body worn thin. On the second hard buck, he spun toward a side she hadn't expected, because she hadn't watched him beforehand, because she hadn't had the time to learn his pattern, and she lost the fit of her body against the motion. She fell before reaching the halfway mark of the required time, rolling clear fast, not badly hurt, but not quick enough getting up to hide how much it had cost her, in the body and in her pride both. It was the worst time logged that whole round. A small cluster of spectators laughed, no meanness in it, just the kind of laugh that comes out at an ugly fall, and one of the officials logged the low number without comment. Cordell, watching from the rail, shook his head, disappointed, not angry, The kind of disappointment that comes from expecting more out of a competitor who'd been turning heads all week. "Thought that one had something different," he said to a hand standing near him. "Nothing there today." Josephine heard the comment from a distance, still sitting in the dirt, trying to catch her breath, and it hurt worse than the fall itself. Not because Cordell knew who she really was, but because for the first time since starting the disguise, she didn't know if she could keep going. An older hand, who'd also watched the fall up close, came over while she gathered her glove off the ground. A man of few words, known for having worked years back alongside Silas himself, though Josephine had no way of knowing that yet. "Get up fast," he said, offering a hand to pull her the rest of the way. "A bad fall only turns into a humiliation if you sit in the dirt too long after. Get on your feet, brush yourself off, walk out like it was part of the plan." She followed the advice, more on instinct than conviction, and walked out of the pen upright despite the ache throbbing in her shoulder and knee. Neither Cordell nor Ashford, nor anybody else in the arena noticed what that simple act cost her. The result left her in a wild card round set for the next morning, one last chance against a tougher bull held back for that purpose. Leaving the arena, she overheard Ashford telling Cordell the new kid had shown his real level now, that the strong first round had probably just been luck, and Cordell, to her surprise, didn't fully agree. "Everybody eats dirt sometime," he said. "Let him try the wild card before you write him off." Back at the clinic that afternoon, she lied again about her day, said nothing about the fall. The doctor said later that evening that Silas's heart was working right at the edge of what it could take, could hold on for days, maybe weeks if he stayed calm, but every day without surgery raised the risk. That night, in a stiff chair beside his bed, Josephine seriously thought about quitting. She called Rosalie, voice low. "I don't think I can do it," she said. "Fell today, fell ugly, and I'm tired of lying to everybody I love." "You're not faking it," Rosalie answered. "You're trying. That's different. And your dad, even without knowing any of this, would want you to try." Josephine sat with that a long while, then went back to her father's bedside and realized the mistake that day hadn't been riding poorly. It had been riding without watching anything first, rushed and exhausted, skipping the one method that had always worked. That, at least, had a fix. She arranged with the overnight nurse to call if anything changed, folded the number into her jeans pocket like extra insurance, and before she managed to close her eyes, heard her father murmur something in his sleep, low, hard to make out, something about a boy who used to watch him train, decades back, from outside the fence. She reached the arena before the sun was fully up the next morning, unhurried this time, having slept a little and eaten before leaving. The overnight nurse had already called once to say her father passed the night stable. It wasn't full relief, but it let her breathe right before walking into the pen. The bull held back for the wild card was dark almost all over, with a ragged white blaze across his forehead, big through the shoulders, no history yet logged in the stock contractor's book because he was new that season. Nobody could say much about his temperament. Josephine stood outside the fence a good long while and watched, quiet, the way she'd done since she was a girl, while the other wild card riders talked nervous among themselves, trying to guess what to expect from an animal none of them had ever seen. After a while, she noticed the bull tossed his head a certain way every time somebody slammed the metal gate at the far end of the pen. A small movement, almost nothing, but repeated every single time that sound came. It was the same kind of sign she'd spent her whole life learning to look for. Not the obvious behavior, but the small gesture nobody else bothered to notice. When her turn came, she already knew what to expect. She asked the gate man quietly to close it careful, without slamming it. He looked at her strange, but did what she asked. The bull came out of the chute, without the burst of anger that usually followed that sound, and that alone took most of the unpredictability out of the first, hard buck. Josephine rode calm, reading every movement before it fully happened, shifting her weight right on time. No rush at all this time. When the horn sounded, she was still mounted, steady, no sign of extra strain beyond what was needed. And the whole pen noticed this time. A small group who'd watched the ugly fall the day before, commenting, surprised, that the same rider who'd fallen so bad now had one of the best times of the whole round. An older official who'd worked that rodeo more than 20 years remarked to the man next to him that he rarely saw somebody correct a mistake that fast, day to day. He didn't know it wasn't really a correction. It was Josephine going back to doing what she'd always known how to do, after a day circumstances had kept her from it. The result came through before noon. She'd advanced to the finals. The finals brought a different setup than she'd pictured. A notice on the office wall laid it out plain. Wade Cordell would ride Widowmaker, the rankest bull in the stock, the same animal he'd covered for the arena record 2 seasons running, and whichever finalist posted the best result of the day after that would get the chance to ride the same bull that same afternoon, a shot at matching or beating that legendary ride. The purse doubled from the day's normal payout. Josephine felt her stomach turn reading it. It wasn't just competing against Cordell from a distance anymore, each on a separate bull. It meant riding the same animal he'd turned into a legend in front of the same crowd that had watched him do it. She asked around the stock pens first, trying to learn anything about Widowmaker's behavior. But one of the hands, worn out from answering the same question all day, just said the bull was tough as they came and left it at that. Nobody seemed able to explain exactly what made that particular animal so hard to ride. Just that it was. She stopped by his pen from a safe distance anyway, watched his stillness, the kind that isn't calm, a body holding its strength in reserve for the right moment, but couldn't learn enough from that far off. She needed more than her own eyes this time. She needed somebody who'd already seen an animal of that kind up close, decades back. She reached the clinic late in the day and finally told her father a part of the truth, that she'd been competing hidden in a division that didn't let women in, chasing the purse that would cover his surgery. Silas sat quiet, then shook his head slow, more impressed than angry. "Always knew you had more grit than sense," he said. "Wonder where you got that from." "I have to ride Widowmaker tomorrow," Josephine said. "Cordell's bull. I need something, Dad. Anything." Silas went serious, eyes fixed on some point on the wall. "Widowmaker's not the first rank bull out of that bloodline I've seen. Back in my day, there was one from the same stock. An animal like that tenses through the neck and shoulder right before he decides which way he'll spin. Almost nobody sees it, happens too fast, but you can feel it if you've spent enough time close to one built the same way." He walked her through the motions slow, his own hand moving over the side table, and she locked it into memory the way she always locked in anything important. "Had a boy years back," Silas said, still a little lost in it, "who used to stand outside the old corral fence, watching me work a bull kind of like that. Never came in, never asked a thing. Learned the hard way on his own. Don't recall his name, just recall the way he watched." Josephine felt something run up her arm. Thought of Cordell watching her since the second go-round, bothered, not sure why. Thought of that line, "Rides like somebody from an older time." She couldn't be sure, not from that alone, but something started fitting together, piece by piece, the way a strange animal's behavior finally makes sense after enough watching. "Does that change anything?" her father asked. "Might change everything," she answered low. "Or might not change a thing. Tomorrow I'll find out." The arena was packed by the time Wade Cordell rode Widowmaker that afternoon. He covered the full 8 seconds clean, exactly like he had 2 years running, and stepped off to a standing ovation. Nobody in that grandstand doubted the record still stood untouched. Josephine watched from the rail, thinking of her father back at the clinic hoping for good news, and made up her mind. She was going to try Widowmaker too. A murmur ran through the crowd when her name got called, most of them assuming it was just another young rider chasing a long shot. Before climbing the chute rail, She closed her eyes a moment and ran through the motion her father had shown her, locking it into her body, not just her thinking, and nodded to the gate man. Widowmaker came out twisted hard, throwing his body sideways before his back legs cleared the ground. A violence to it that felt different from anything else she'd drawn all season, the whole chute rattling with the force of it. Josephine felt the neck tense, exactly the way her father had described. A beat before the full spin, and adjusted her weight before the motion had finished, the way she'd been trained to do since she was too small to see over the corral fence. On the second hard turn, her hand slipped inside the glove, a finger caught wrong against the rope, and the pain shot clean up her arm, sharp enough to white out her vision for half a second. She locked her body down and held on, thinking of her father, the surgery, a deadline that had never once waited for anybody. The announcer called the seconds out loud over the speakers, the crowd gone quiet, holding its breath through everyone. Josephine felt the 5th second pass, then the 6th. A low sound escaping her without meaning to, teeth clenched, hands still locked around the rope, even as the broken finger screamed against it. On the 7th, the wind, or the bull's own violent motion, tore the hat clean off her head and sent it spinning out into the dirt. What was left of her hair spilled loose in the arena lights, and there wasn't any hiding what that meant anymore. By the 8th second, when the horn finally sounded, the whole grandstand had already seen that the rider holding on that long, matching a time the champion himself had sworn nobody else could touch, was a woman. A strange hush settled over the stands, the kind of quiet that comes right before a crowd decides all at once what to do with what it just watched. Then, the murmur rose, spreading fast, people pointing at the hat lying in the dirt. Josephine kicked free and hit the ground, rolling clear, cradling her broken finger against her body as she came up. Vince Ashford stood frozen near the rail, stopwatch still in his hand, repeating under his breath that it shouldn't be possible. He pulled the rule book out from under his arm, the same one he'd carried all season, and read out loud the section defining a covered, qualified ride. Found nothing about who was or wasn't allowed to compete. Only an age bracket and a weight limit for the animal itself. He closed the book and announced loud enough for the stands to hear that the time stood. A reporter from the local radio station pushed him hard, asking whether the irregular entry called for some kind of investigation. Ashford shook his head. The rule talks about completing a qualified ride. She completed it. The rest is a rule this circuit never bothered writing down properly, and that's not on her. Wade Cordell reached her first, before any official or reporter got close. He offered his hand, the same hand that weeks earlier hadn't bothered to look up from a clipboard. "Whose girl are you?" he asked, none of the old edge left in his voice. "Silas Tillman's," Josephine answered, breath ragged, injured hand held tight against her chest. Cordell went quiet, pieces falling into place, the old corral memory, the young man who used to watch from outside a fence, the riding style he'd always believed he'd built alone. He pulled off his own hat, the one that had come to stand for the record he'd defended 2 years running, and held it out. "This belonged to your father," he said. He just never knew it. Applause built through the stands, uneven at first, then steady, words spreading fast about why she'd needed the money bad enough to cut her hair and lie her way into a division that never wanted her there. The combined purse, Cordell's bonus for defending the mark and her own for matching it, came to more than enough to cover the full $120,000, with plenty left to hire somebody who could push the insurance letter through the Cheyenne office faster than she ever could have managed driving up there herself. Every ride out there needed the full 10 count to score, the announcer had reminded the crowd earlier that day, though anybody who'd watched the sport long enough knew he'd misspoken. And the mistake made its way into the local paper the following week without anybody bothering to correct it. Josephine called her father from the arena, hand hastily wrapped, voice shaking from pain and relief at once. "I got it, Dad," she said. "I got the whole thing." His voice shook too, though not from the same thing. "I know who you are, Josephine," he said. "Always could pick out my own way of sitting a horse, even hidden under some borrowed hat." Weeks later, with the surgery scheduled and the insurance letter finally settled, Josephine walked back into that entry office one last time. No disguise this time. Her hair still growing out short, a strip of tape still holding her broken finger straight. She wrote her own name on the form, in the same careful cursive she'd used the first time, and nobody behind that table laughed. Wade Cordell was there again, checking entries the way he always had, and when a young woman stepped up, asking about next season's open division, he stopped what he was doing, looked up, and asked, with a kind of attention he'd never once given anybody at that table before, where she'd learned to ride. Later that afternoon, standing by the rail watching a fresh string of green bulls get run through the chutes, Cordell mentioned, almost to himself, that his own father had never talked much about his years on the circuit either, except for one thing he used to say, that he owed a debt to a man named Tillman he never got around to paying, and that he'd died before Cordell ever thought to ask him what he meant by it. Josephine didn't have an answer for that yet. Filed it away instead, the same way her own father had once filed away a story about a boy who used to watch him from outside a fence, without knowing yet how much it would matter. Silas came home from the surgery 3 weeks later, slower on his feet, but breathing easy for the first time in longer than either of them wanted to admit. And the first thing he did once he could stand a full afternoon again was walk out to the old corral and watch his daughter work a green colt, quiet, from outside the fence, the way somebody had once watched him. Out where the wind doesn't stop for anybody's comfort, a person learns early that the surest way through fear isn't to fight it head on. It's to watch it long enough to know exactly when it's going to move.